Hey guys, Spud here, and I can hear that collective groan from all my users in the background right now. Don't worry guys, we are not doing another cold start tutorial. Rather, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the air-to-air component of your loadouts for your F-15E so you can create the most realistic loadouts possible for your own practice runs, your squadron missions, or even the campaign makers that are out there. This will also probably lead into a bit of a discussion about how the F-15E fits into the larger United States Air Force force structure, and then that'll probably snowball into talking about the smaller air forces that use the Strike Eagle and Advanced Strike Eagle variants and how they fit into those smaller force structures, and how that influences the air-to-air loadouts and air-to-ground loadouts of those smaller air forces. So let's jump right in, guys. In front of us, we have our prototypical loadout for our F-15 Eagle. We've got 4 GBU-12s on each CFT, and the component of the loadouts that leads to a lot of misconceptions and questions out there is the fact that we have a Sidewinder on the inside rail and an AMRAAM on the outside rail. Now, a lot of guys, very understandably question, well, isn't that not really a good idea? Aren't you kind of blocking the field of view of the seeker head of the AIM-9 Sidewinder by putting it on the inboard rail? And isn't that even worse if you have, say, a high-off boresight capable missile like an AIM-9 X-ray on that rail, or in the case of the F-15I, like a Python 4 or Python 5? And yes, you would absolutely be correct about all of that. However, there is a pretty good reason as to why you typically see Sidewinders on the inboard rail. This is Station 8A, and of course on Station 2A over on the other side. Now, of course, there are definitely exceptions to this rule, and you can find copious pictures out there of these exceptions that we'll also talk about. Now, why is it that Sidewinders are typically loaded on that inboard rail, even on albino Eagles like F-15As, Bs, Cs, and Ds, which are typically air-to-air focused in the USAF? Well, the reason for that is the way that missiles are actually loaded onto their rails or pylons on an aircraft. Now, the AIM-9 Sidewinder and its various variants, typically starting from the AIM-9 Lima up through the Mike and X-ray, typically weigh, depending on the variant, just under 250 pounds to just over 250 pounds. And because of that weight, if you have a couple big guys or big gals, you can actually physically and manually pick the missile up, hold it up, and attach it to the missile rail on your F-15. However, the AIM-120 AMRAAM and its variants from the AIM-120A through the AIM-120C and into the D, depending on the model, typically weigh just under or just over again to 350 pounds, which is really heavy. Typically, that means that weapons lifter trucks are used to load AIM-120 AMRAAMs onto the missile rails of various F-15 variants in the USAF inventory. It's just the simple fact that the missile is really darn heavy, and so it just can't manually be loaded up onto the rail by some big, strong guys. I'm sure in a pinch it can definitely be done, but it's not typically done. And so because of this, if we have an external fuel tank or we have a weapon on the top station of the CFT, that leaves very little room for the weapon lifter truck to use its lifter to lift an AIM-120 up and onto that inner rail. Now, there are definitely exceptions to this rule, and let's take a look at a couple of pictures of some real F-15E loadouts. So we can see, just like the loadout that we have in front of us today, we've got a couple GBU-12s on the CFTs and AIM-9 Sidewinders on the inboard rails. We've got Sidewinder on Station 2B and 8A there. Now, if we keep scrolling through some pictures here, another example, even though we don't have a weapon on the upper CFT station on this F-15E, the ground crew still elected to load the AIM-9 on the inner rail, probably because the external fuel tank there was attached to the aircraft prior to actually loading the missile onto Station 2B there. Moving on, we can see here that we have a bit of an exception to that rule. We've got an AIM-9 Sidewinder on the inboard station over on this side, and we've got an AIM-120 on the inboard station over on this side. We can also see that there's no weapon attached to the upper CFT station on this F-15E. So the weapon lifter truck had plenty of room to lift the AIM-120 up there for the ground crew to then attach the missile to that inner rail. It may have been that the external fuel tank was already attached to Station 8 here, and so they didn't want to try and kind of jigsaw puzzle the lifter truck in there to get the AIM-120 on the inner station on this side of the aircraft. Moving on here, we can see that yet another change to the loadout. We've got two AIM-120s on Station 2A and 2B, and we can see that there is no weapon attached to the upper CFT station here, so the lifter truck had plenty of room to lift that AIM-120 AMRAAM up and onto Station 2B there. Whereas on the other side, we've got what looks like to be an AIM-9 and potentially another AIM-9 on the other side, maybe an AIM-120. And so that there was no room for that lifter truck to lift an AIM-120 in there and then attach it via the ground crew. Something else that's kind of interesting to note here is that we have an AIM-120A or AIM-120B on Station 2A here, and it looks to be an AIM-120C or some variant of the AIM-120C on the inner station. That kind of shows us that a lot of USAF units kind of mix and match between different AMRAAM units, or AMRAAM variants, I should say, and it's not uncommon to see multiple types of AMRAAMs on a single aircraft. Moving on to our last picture here, we have another example of an AIM-9 Sidewinder on the inboard station of 8A there, and the AIM-120 on the outboard station. Again, there's no weapon on that upper CFT station, but it still is much, much easier to just manually load that Sidewinder onto the inner station, as opposed to loading an AMRAAM on that inner station. So let's look at some other loadouts here. This is typically what you would probably think you'd expect a F-15E's air-to-air portion of its loadout to be, right? The AIM-9 should be on the outboard side, so that way its seeker head has as much field of view as possible to lock onto a target and then be launched and hopefully down that enemy MiG. We got the same thing on the other side, but like we said earlier, just to reiterate, if we have a weapon on that upper CFT station and we have an external fuel tank, there's just no room for that lifter truck to lift up the missile in there to be attached by the ground crew. Over here on this aircraft, we can see that we have 4 AIM-120s on it. Now, there are definitely photos out there of F-15Es loaded up with air-to-ground loadouts and carrying 4 AIM-120 AMRAAMs. Again, this wouldn't really be all that realistic because we do have weapons on that upper CFT station, as we can see on both sides there, because there wouldn't be much room for that lifter truck. But maybe the ground crew that day had gone in a different order of loading the weapons. Typically, when you see videos of ground crew loading weapons onto F-15Es, you see them go through the air-to-ground portion, loading bombs onto the CFTs, then moving to the air-to-air missiles. Maybe they did it in the opposite direction this time, so they had plenty of room for that lifter truck's arm. Moving to our next F-15 here, we have our typical kind of Desert Storm loadout, where the F-15E, when it was rushed into service just in time for Operation Desert Storm in 1991, obviously there were no AIM-120s in the operational inventory of the USAF. And so F-15Es typically carried 4 AIM-9 Sidewinders that of course had their bombs on the CFTs. Now, this led to the opening stages of the Desert Storm campaign, where F-15E crews actually engaged MiG-29 Fulcrums, or were very close to being engaged by MiG-29 Fulcrums, but had to break off pursuit because they did not have the correct weapons to engage the MiG-29s at that time. There are a number of F-15E pilots and Wizzos out there who flew in the opening stages of Operation Desert Storm that say if they were loaded with AIM-7 Sparrows on their CFTs the way their albino F-15 brothers were, they could have downed a couple of MiG-29s in the opening stages of the war. However, the AIM-7 Sparrow is just too big and heavy to put on stations 2A and B and 8A and B. Moving on to this side, it's actually pretty cool and pretty common to see photographs of pretty asymmetrical loadouts when it comes to the air-to-air portion of the loadout on an F-15E. We have two AIM-120 AMRAAMs on one side and two AIM-9 Sidewinders on the other side. Obviously, the ground crew elected to put the AIM-9 Sidewinders on Station 2A and B because of that GBU-12 on the upper CFT station there, whereas they had plenty of room again for the lifter truck to get that AIM-120 up and onto Station 8A there. Asymmetrical loadouts on the F-15E are really not much of a concern for F-15E crews because of the fact that the stations that air-to-air missiles as well as bombs hang off of are pretty darn close to the longitudinal axis of the F-15E. So thus you don't have very long of an arm to put a bunch of lever force onto the aircraft, forcing it to roll when you drop a bomb off of it. It's very similar to the F-14 Tomcat dropping bombs out of its tunnel. When you drop one big old bomb off the F-14, it's almost not noticeable to the controls of the aircraft. This is true as well for the F-15E Strike Eagle. Now, technically, there are more stations on the wings of our F-15E. We have Station 1 and Station 9 on the outer portion of the wings. However, because the aircraft is not fly-by-wire, the arm out to those stations and the moment that would be created via an asymmetrical loadout, say firing a missile off of that pylon or dropping a bomb off that pylon, would be too much for the pilot to counteract and then control if there was an asymmetrical loadout on those two furthest outboard stations. And thus they've been deleted and are not active on USAF F-15Es, F-15Is, F-15Ss, F-15Ks, F-15SGs, and any other non-fly-by-wire variant of the F-15E Strike Eagle. Kind of cool stuff, guys. I hope you guys are enjoying this discussion. I definitely am. So that leads to the question of, well, Spud, why don't the ground crews and or pilots or mission planners, what have you, prefer to just take the time or take the care, I guess care is the wrong word, more like take the time to just put the Sidewinder in the outboard station, the AIM-120 on the inboard station, and do that first, then do the bombs. And the reason is, like, the hyper lethality of the air-to-air loadout of an F-15E is not really the biggest question in the mind of F-15E planners or pilots. The reason for that is because of how the F-15E fits into the larger USAF force structure. F-15Es to the USAF are essentially bombers. They were procured to replace the F-111 Aardvark, which is itself basically a pure bomber. And so the F-15E does have the capability of being a fantastic self-escort platform and can be pushed back to that pure air-to-air role in an emergency, but in USAF doctrine, the F-15E is a bomber. So we don't have to worry about being, perfectly perfect when it comes to our air-to-air loadout. There's plenty of other assets in the USAF inventory that can take that role, such as F-16s who are potentially providing defensive or offensive counter-air, F-22s who might be escorting the F-15Es, albino Eagles, F-15Cs and Ds who are on that OCA or DCA tasking, and a bunch of other different aircraft who might be specifically tasked to that counter-air, so that way the F-15Es are freed up to do their thing that they do best, which is dropping bombs on strategic and tactical targets, not necessarily defending themselves or providing defensive or offensive counter-air. Now, if a squirter does get through and does come after an F-15E, they're absolutely more than capable of defending themselves with their AMRAAMs and their Sidewinders. It just doesn't matter all that much that the seeker head of the AIM-9 on our F-15E here just can't see quite as much as if it was on the outboard station. Now, let's talk about the smaller air forces that use the Strike Eagle and Advanced Strike Eagle variants. They might be more inclined to try to optimize their air-to-air loadouts of their F-15E Strike Eagles as much as possible in order to get the absolute most out of them, because those smaller air forces, Saudi Arabia, Korea, Singapore, to name a few, don't have as many assets to take over that defensive or offensive counter-air tasking. And so a advanced Strike Eagle or Strike Eagle variant belonging to Saudi Arabia or Singapore or the Republic of Korea might be more in a position where they will actually have to defend themselves from an enemy MiG because there aren't as many jets out there to take over and purely hunt enemy aircraft in the air-to-air mode. This also kind of feeds into, well, why does the USAF F-15E not have the AGM-88 harm? Well, that's because, again, how the F-15E fits into the USAF force structure. There's a ton of F-16s in the USAF that are fitted with the harm, and that's their main job, is providing that CAD and DAD capability. Whereas it's the F-15E squadron's main job to get big bombs onto big targets on time. If you look at, say, the advanced Strike Eagle variants that belong to Saudi Arabia or Singapore or Qatar, those aircraft are actually capable of firing harms and firing other specialized weapons, like the various versions of the AGM-84 Harpoon missile in the case of the Republic of Korea Air Force. And so that's because, again, they just don't have those assets. They don't have just gobs and gobs of F-16s who are just ready-made harm shooters. So they have to push their advanced Strike Eagles and other Strike Eagle variants into more diverse roles than you would see in the USAF. So I hope this was interesting for you guys, and hopefully it leads to you guys creating more realistic air-to-air components of your F-15E Strike Eagle loadouts. Whether you're flying as a USAF F-15E or you're pushing the DCS F-15E module into a more a different variant. Maybe it's the F-15SG, the F-15K, the F-15S or SA, or the F-15QA. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and please leave a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.